Recently, in the final episode of The Acolyte, we saw a Kyber crystal being bled for the first time in live action. This, however, isn't the first time this has happened in canon, and also works very differently than some of these other times. In this video, I explain Kyber crystal bleeding, moving through each time we've seen a crystal bleed in release order, and investigating how the process has changed over time. I hope you enjoy. The first appearance of Kyber crystal bleeding came in the comic Darth Vader 5 from 2017. At the start of this comic, Palpatine gives a nice little explanation of what it means to bleed a Kyber crystal to Vader, saying, "You have acquired the lightsaber of a Jedi and the Kyber crystal it contains, but they are not yet yours. The crystal is a potent thing, alive in some strange way, pulsing with light side energy. You will need great strength to bend it to your will. When you arrive on Mustafar, find the place where the dark side calls to you. Draw upon the energy there, combine its power with your own. Then use it. Corrupt the Kyber crystal. Teach it your pain. Teach it your anger. Hear it sing a hymn of darkness. Make it bleed." The process is presented as difficult, with Palpatine sending Vader somewhere strong with the dark side and telling him that he must force the crystal to bleed by pouring his pain and anger into it. The procedure is very intentional. Vader then takes apart the Jedi lightsaber he has and removes the crystal, using the Force on it. The crystal fights back, knocking him back and seemingly pulling him back towards the light. Vader then receives a vision where he goes back to Palpatine on Coruscant, revealing a still green lightsaber, which he proceeds to kill his master with. He then goes to Obi-Wan in regret. However, Vader wakes up from this vision, his eyes now a Sith yellow. He grabs the Kyber crystal and pours the dark side into it. Painful memories resurface, and power surges from the crystal. He visits Palpatine, this time not in a vision, and reveals a red lightsaber. In this comic, Vader, an extremely powerful Sith, put great effort into bleeding his crystal, experiencing a lot of pushback. The process was difficult. Next time we see Kyber crystal bleeding is in the comic The Rise of Kylo Ren 4 from 2020. In this comic, less time is dedicated to Kyber crystal bleeding than before, but the process is quite similar. Kylo takes his old lightsaber apart and holds the crystal. Just as Vader's did, his eyes turn bright yellow. Energy surges from the crystal, wrapping around the entire ship he's in, and visions of people he once cared about haunt him. The crystal bleeds and cracks. Just as with Vader, it took a lot of effort for Kylo to bleed the crystal, with a lot of pushback. Even more specifically, both Kylo and Vader grip their crystals tightly, and what looks like lightning surges from the crystals. There are some minor differences, such as Kylo seemingly not being pulled to the light, or shown a vision, and the lightning being a different colour, but the procedure is presented in a very similar way overall. Also, to provide some context, this happened not long after he destroyed Luke's Jedi temple, and murdered the only 3 surviving Jedi students, who'd been his friends, so he was deep in the dark side at this point. After this is Jedi Survivor, which changes the process massively. Let's take a quick look at how this scene plays out. As you can see, Dagon exposes the Kyber crystal, and takes it out of the lightsaber hilt, as both Vader and Kylo did, intentionally pouring his anger into it, but this time, things are different. There really isn't much pushback from the crystal. It just shifts colour as he speaks, until it bursts out a surge of energy upon completion. It really doesn't seem like the process took Dagon a lot of effort. I would say that Dagon had a lot of darkness to pull from at this time, bearing in mind that he felt that both the Jedi Order and his most trusted friend abandoned him. Also, he had around 200 years inside a Bacta tank to build his anger, meaning that Dagon had a lot to pull from when bleeding his crystal, but it is strange that there was no pushback. Next there's the comic, The High Republic, Shadows of Starlight 1, which gives us what appears to be a glimpse of Kyber crystal bleeding in a flashback. Here we see Azlin Rel, a Jedi driven mad by terrifying creatures called the Nameless, holding a bled Kyber crystal through the Force. We don't actually see how he did it, so we can't compare the process, but I'd say that the bleeding looks intentional and that it involved removing the crystal from the lightsaber, if it was in one to begin with. After this, there's what appears to be another quick glimpse at Kyber crystal bleeding from earlier this year. In the comic Star Wars 43 from 2024, we see Luke attempt to purify a Kyber crystal. As he does this, he sees the Sith who bled the crystal, holding it up through the Force. This is very similar to what we saw with Azlin, and shows intentionality and the requirement of removing the crystal. Finally, there's the most recent case of Kyber crystal bleeding, from the Acolyte. This has been the topic of a lot of discussion lately, particularly because of how different it is from past cases of Kyber crystal bleeding. Here Osha gets very angry with Sol, falling into the dark side and strangling him. As she is doing this, she is holding Sol's lightsaber. We then see the crystal shift from blue to red. The bleeding process appears quite quick and effortless. Later this process is continued when Osha ignites the lightsaber and it starts out blue but slowly shifts to being red. The red colouring slowly shifts up the blade as the crystal changes. Osha is clearly taken by surprise at the changing colour of the lightsaber, which means that the bleeding was not intentional. Here the process is more similar to how it was in Jedi Survivor than in the comics, with the crystal bleeding quite quickly and easily, without pushback. However, the big difference is that the crystal had not been removed, although it is relatively exposed, bearing in mind that it's easily visible, and that Osha really wasn't trying to pour any of her pain or anger into the crystal. Also, we've never seen the lightsaber blade take time to shift colour before, although this is probably because Osha is less certain of the darkness at this point. This presents another change, as previously Kyber crystal bleeding has appeared quite absolute, not really having an in-between stage. Note the blast when Dagon Gera completes his Kyber crystal bleeding. So yeah, looking at the history of Kyber crystal bleeding, it seems that it started as an important step in embracing the dark side, conveying commitment to those ways, and showing that the owner was powerful enough to overcome the crystal and force it to obey. This idea was conveyed in both the Vader comic and the Kylo Ren comic, although not as detailed in the latter. The process was then simplified, likely for efficiency, as the process so far wasn't a quick one. In Jedi Survivor, this efficiency seems to have been chosen so that the reveal of Dagon Gera as a Darksider is clear and very visual. Afterwards, the comics seem to have wanted to connote Kyber crystal bleeding without getting into the details, because while the process is important, we don't always need to see it being carried out fully. Finally, there's the Acolyte, which appears to have moved just a little beyond Jedi Survivor, also desiring visual cue of its character's alignment. However, this time, the changes were greater due to the accidental nature of the bleeding. Anyway, I hope you enjoyed this dive into the history of Kyber crystal bleeding. Thanks for watching, and we hope to see you later at Volt Holocron.